If you ever find yourself on a desolate road, running low on gas, don't stop. Because not everything that looks old is just old, sometimes. It holds a cursed soul within. Jake was on a long drive in his 2021 gray Toyota. It was March 10th, 2023, and the clock had ticked past midnight. As he cruised down a desolate road, his fuel gauge hit red. Then, in the beam of his headlights, an old gas station came into view. The neon sign read, "Last Stop," but most of the letters were burnt out or rusted. With no other options, Jake pulled into the station. The place was a wreck. Rusted pumps, broken and dusty windows, and a tin sign creaking in the wind. Jake worked the pump himself and filled his tank. The screen showed just $8. "What the hell?" he muttered. In 2023, gas couldn't be that cheap. Suspicious, he headed inside to pay. The interior was dim and dusty, but a man stood behind the counter, Earl. He had a pale, tired face, and his uniform bore a name tag that read Earl. "Cash or card?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'll pay with a card," Jake said. Earl shook his head. "No POS, cash only." Jake pulled a $10 bill from his pocket. "Keep the change and grab me some gummy bears," he said, pointing to a dusty jar on the counter. Earl scooped a handful into a paper bag and took the money. Jake grabbed the bag but didn't touch the gummies. Something about the place felt off. As he turned to leave, Earl pulled a huge, rusty sword from under the counter. Jake froze. "What are you doing?" he yelled. Earl stepped out, gripping the sword with both hands, and said calmly, "This is the last stop." Jake bolted for the door, Earl chasing after him. Jake barely made it to his car, yanked the door open, and jumped in. Earl leaped onto the hood, raised the sword, and slammed it into the windshield. The glass cracked, shards raining over Jake. He started the engine and floored it, the car lurching forward, sending Earl tumbling to the ground. In the rearview mirror, Jake saw Earl lying there, smiling up at him. That grin chilled him to the bone. A few miles down the road, Jake's hands shook as he dialed the police. "Someone chased me with a sword! At the last stop gas station, please come quick!" he shouted. The officer on the line asked, "Calm down, where's that?" "What town?" Jake gave the name and recounted everything. "Units are on the way," the officer said. "Get somewhere safe." When Jake got home, he was still in shock. The next morning, the town's police department called. "We checked out your report from last night," the officer said. "We went to Last Stop, but it was empty. The counters, the pumps, everything was abandoned, rusted, covered in dust. No one was there, no man, no sword." Jake swallowed hard. "What?" "Someone chased me," he insisted. The officer paused, then said, "We looked into the records. That station shut down on May 15th, 1980. According to the archives, a guy named Earl chopped up a woman with a sword that day. When the cops showed up, he pulled the sword on them and they shot him dead right there in the station. It's been abandoned ever since. No one was there last night." Jake's head spun. After hanging up, he grabbed the gummy bear bag from the glove compartment and checked the label. Expiration date, May 15th, 1980. The same day the station closed, the day Earl died. The bag slipped from his hands, his breath catching. He couldn't let this go. He took the gummies and drove to the town police station. The officer took the bag, frowning. "This says 1980, he asked, looking at Jake in disbelief. "Where'd you get this?" Jake explained everything, Earl, the sword, the chase. The officer pulled the old case file and flipped through it. "The description you gave matches Earl from that day," he said, his voice uneasy. "But that's impossible. This place has been empty for 43 years. No one could have been there." They took the gummies as evidence, but the officer's face showed pure confusion. When Jake got home, he glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see Earl's grin, but it was empty. The police kept the case open. The gummy bear expiration date, Earl's identity, and whatever happened at that abandoned station remained a mystery. Jake never took that road again. So, what do you think really happened that night? Was Jake's experience just a hallucination? Or did he truly step into a place that shouldn't exist? And that jelly bean? How did it end up in his hands, decades after the station was abandoned? Let me know in the comments. Michael had been stopping at the same gas station after work for years. The rundown spot off the highway was nothing special, but he always used Pump 4. It was fast, usually empty, and part of his routine. But on the night of March 10th, 2023, everything felt wrong. He slid his card into the slot, and the screen went black for a moment before flashing an odd message. Last transaction, March 12th, 1973. Michael frowned, assuming it was a glitch. He shrugged, started pumping, and listened to the familiar hum. But the gallon counter didn't move. He stood there for minutes, hearing the fuel flow, yet the display stayed at 0. Irritated, he decided to ask the clerk inside. The station was its usual grimy self, flickering fluorescent lights, a messy counter, and the stale smell of old coffee. The scrawny guy behind the counter, wearing a faded Ray name tag, looked up as Michael approached. "Pump 4's busted," Michael said, nodding toward the window. "It says the last transaction was 1973, and it's not pumping anything." Ray's face went pale. He leaned forward, voice shaky and low. "You used Pump 4? Michael nodded, puzzled by the reaction. "Yeah, what's the big deal?" Ray took a deep breath, glanced nervously outside, and muttered, "That pump last ran exactly 50 years ago." The guy who filled up that night disappeared. Vanished with his car, never found. Michael smirked, brushing it off. "Come on, don't feed me creepy campfire stories." Ray didn't push it, just stared at him with uneasy eyes. Michael shook his head and headed back to his car, ready to chalk it up to a broken pump and a weird clerk. But when he checked the fuel gauge, his stomach sank. The tank was still empty. He'd heard the pump running, yet not a drop had gone in. A shiver ran down his spine. He got in and sped off. When he got home, he found his wife, Lisa, in the kitchen. "Something weird happened at the gas station," he said, his voice unsteady. "I used Pump 4. The screen showed 1973 and no fuel came out. The clerk said some guy vanished 50 years ago after using it." Lisa frowned. "Is this a joke?" Michael shook his head. "I wish. The tank's empty, but I heard it pumping." Then, as if drawn to it, he added, "I saw an old car in the rearview mirror. Some guy staring at me, terrified. But when I looked back, nothing was there." Lisa grew worried. "You're probably just tired. Maybe you imagined it," she said. But Michael's face stayed ghostly white. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of Pump 4 hummed in his ears. Early the next morning, he mumbled, "I need some air," and grabbed his keys. Lisa never saw him again. 2 days later, a hiker found Michael in the woods outside town. He was sprawled on the ground, clothes torn, face smeared with mud, his wrist snapped. An ambulance rushed him to the hospital, but he was in bad shape. The doctors said he'd been out there for 2 days without food or water. His organs were shutting down. That night, Michael died in the hospital bed. Lisa told the doctors his last words were about Pump 4, but no one could make sense of it. After Michael went missing, Ray, the station clerk, decided enough was enough. He had Pump 4 ripped out. The rusted old thing was hauled off with a backhoe and sent to the scrapyard. The station stayed open, but no one could explain what happened that night. Michael's car sat in front of his house, the tank still empty. Pump 4 is gone. But is it really? Or will it appear again? Somewhere else? In Joseph City, the paranormal never ends. Subscribe, and join the darkness. And don't forget to like the video.